King Philip II forcefully burst into his son's bedroom by himself. He entered not in a fatherly manner, but as a general orchestrating an invasion, fully dressed in battle armor. Prince Don Carlos, the heir to the mightiest empire on the planet, was abruptly awakened to find his room crowded with armed guards, with his own father leading them. The king's expression was one of cold determination, and his eyes were impossible to read behind his steel visor. In that chilling, breathless moment, the prince realized this was not a lecture or a punishment, it was an arrest. The man who had given him life was now here to take away his freedom, and the king's responsibilities were about to crush a father's love. This moment of betrayal within the family would resonate throughout the courts of Europe. But how did it come to this? To grasp how a king could become the captor of his own son and heir, we need to go back to the very beginning, to a royal birth that was seen as both a miraculous blessing and a dreadful hidden curse. Before we dive into the story, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to join us for future explorations into the forgotten parts of history. Before Don Carlos even took his first breath, he was already trapped, a victim of his own lineage. It was 1545, and in the Spanish royal palace, courtiers buzzed with excitement over the anticipated heir. However, behind closed doors, the royal doctors exchanged anxious looks. They knew something that the celebrating nobles did not. This child came from a bloodline so closely intertwined and obsessively pure that it had turned toxic. To the Habsburgs, purity meant something specific. Carlos had just 6 great-great-grandparents, whereas an average person has 16. Take a moment to consider that. 10 of his ancestors had been eliminated due to generations of uncles marrying their nieces and first cousins marrying each other, all to keep the royal bloodline free from contamination by outsiders. The family tree wasn't just branching out, it was suffocating itself. The court scribes noted his birth with elegant quills and golden ink, yet they couldn't capture the unseen damage woven into his very being. When Carlos finally came into the world on July 8, 1545, the midwives observed that his head had an unusual shape, and his cries were weaker than expected. Still, he was alive and he was a boy, which was reason enough to celebrate. His mother, Maria Manuela of Portugal, held him only once. At just 17 years old, she was worn out from a grueling delivery that had ravaged her body. Within hours, a fever took hold. While the court rejoiced over the birth of an heir, Maria's skin felt like it was burning. She whispered prayers in Portuguese, the language of her homeland, while her ladies-in-waiting pressed cool cloths to her forehead. 4 days, that's all she had left. 4 days to be a mother before the infection took her away. The same bells that had rung for Carlos's birth now tolled for Maria's funeral. The infant prince, wrapped in silk and unaware of his loss, had cost his mother her life before he could even focus his eyes enough to see her face. And this is where it gets truly grim. Maria wasn't just Carlos's mother, she was also his first cousin. Their fathers were brothers, and their mothers were sisters. This wasn't merely a marriage, it was a genetic echo chamber. The same blood that had taken Maria's life now flowed through Carlos, carrying with it generations of accumulated damage. King Philip, still just 20 years old, stood at his wife's funeral, cradling his infant son. The courtiers perceived a mourning widower with his heir, but in that moment, Philip recognized something deeper. He understood the heavy price of purity. Yes, his son had survived, but at what cost? Even more frightening was the thought of what hidden costs might still be looming. The wet nurses reported concerning issues. The baby's feeding was inconsistent, and his sleep patterns were all over the place. He would cry for hours without any apparent reason, then suddenly become eerily silent, which frightened the servants. One nurse insisted she witnessed him stop breathing completely for almost a minute before gasping back to life like someone emerging from underwater. However, issues with infants were not unusual in royal nurseries. The court doctors reassured Philip that the boy would grow up strong. After all, he had the blood of emperors and conquistadors who had claimed vast territories for Spain. Surely that heritage would lead to greatness. They had no clue how mistaken they were. The very blood of emperors was the issue. Each generation of intermarriage had added another link to an invisible chain, and Carlos was burdened by every single one of them. The Habsburg jaw, that well-known deformity, was merely a visible indicator of much deeper issues. What lay beneath was likely to be far worse. The curse wasn't magical. It was simply a matter of genetics. Genetic roulette was a game with increasingly grim odds, and Carlos had already lost before he even had a chance to play. Every cell in his body held the weight of his ancestors' mistakes, pride, and their obsession with keeping power in the family at any expense. He had managed to survive his birth, a motherless prince trapped in a genetic cage. However, the curse of his lineage wasn't just a number on a family tree. It would soon be visible for the whole world to see, marked in his very bones. The royal armorer was sweating as he struggled to fit the breastplate made from the finest Milan steel. Despite measuring the Prince of Aureus 3 times, each measurement only added to the confusion. The left side of the prince's torso dipped inward when it should have been fuller. His right shoulder sat almost 2 inches higher than the left. No amount of hammering or reshaping could make regular armor fit this 13-year-old body that was anything but symmetrical. Carlos stood there with his arms out, watching the armorer struggle. The prince's breathing was quick and shallow, not from exertion, but because his sunken chest couldn't fully expand. Each breath felt like a fight between his deformed ribcage and his lungs. The court tried to ignore it, but Carlos could hear their whispers bouncing off the stone walls. It was becoming impossible to conceal the physical signs of his cursed lineage. His skull had developed unevenly, bulging on one side, like a melon that had been left out in the sun for too long. Palace portraits needed more and more inventive angles to hide his condition. His left leg had ceased growing at the same pace as his right, which made him walk with a strange, lurching gait that clicked and scraped on the marble floors. But here's the catch with divine right. It suggests divine perfection. In 16th century Spain, the king's body was viewed as a sign of God's favor. A strong, symmetrical figure was seen as a heavenly endorsement of the royal lineage. But what did Carlos's distorted form indicate about the Habsburgs? What did it reveal about Spain itself? The court physicians came up with detailed explanations. The prince's moods were all over the place. His fate was sealed from the moment he was born. It was anything but the truth that the generations of Habsburg inbreeding had finally led to this outcome. They recommended treatments that sound brutal by today's standards. They bled him to try to balance his humors, put him in mercury baths to help his spine, and made special iron boots to stretch his shorter leg. Carlos went through it all with such fury that his servants often ran away from him. Each night, when the metal boots were removed, his screams could be heard echoing through the palace halls. It wasn't just pain he felt. It was also rage at his own body's failure. He was meant to be perfect. He was meant to be king. The royal tutors brought even more alarming news. The prince's focus seemed to drift all the time. He often became fixated on odd details, like the pattern of cracks in the ceiling or the sound of his own breathing, while crucial lessons in governance went unnoticed. Sometimes, his speech came out in quick bursts, and other times, he wouldn't speak at all. On certain days, he communicated with the grace expected from someone of his stature, but on others, He struggled to put together coherent sentences, as if his tongue was stumbling over itself. And then there were the headaches, intense, debilitating headaches that would keep him confined to his chambers for days. The servants would often hear him banging his head against the stone walls, trying to relieve the agony with more pain. When he came out, his eyes were often bloodshot and unfocused, as if he were peering through our world into some dreadful other realm. The marriage proposals began to pour in when Carlos turned 14. Royal families from all over Europe sent portraits of their daughters, each one hoping to form an alliance with Spain's sprawling empire. But Philip kept postponing, dodging the issue, and making excuses. How could he possibly send truthful descriptions of his son to prospective brides? How could he explain that the heir to the throne couldn't stand up straight, couldn't breathe properly, and couldn't even wear armor like a genuine Spanish prince? The foreign ambassadors who met with Carlos sent back coded messages to their courts. They carefully noted that the prince displayed signs of weakness. He seems quite fragile. They hesitated to share the truth about the heir to the Spanish throne, who resembled a fragile porcelain doll that had been broken and poorly repaired by someone who couldn't see. The servants had their own quiet speculations. Some believed that the spirit of his mother tormented his twisted body, a punishment for the unnatural union that brought him into existence. Others suggested that his flesh bore the mark of his ancestors' sins, with each deformity representing generations of pride made visible. Yet, the physical flaws were nothing compared to the darkness taking hold within him. A cruel monstrosity was developing in the young prince, ready to emerge in the most horrifying way possible. The royal shoemaker stood there, trembling as he presented the boots. He knew he had made a mistake, but he had no idea that his punishment would be to chop them up and eat them. It all began as a routine fitting in Carlos's chambers. The craftsman had spent weeks creating these boots, designed specifically to fit the prince's shorter leg. However, when Carlos tried them on, the left boot pinched him just enough to ignite a fury that turned the elegant room into a scene of humiliation. "Eat them," Carlos ordered, his voice unnaturally calm. The shoemaker chuckled nervously, thinking he must have misheard. But the prince's eyes, bloodshot and unfocused, showed no trace of humor. "Cut them into pieces and eat them." The court watched in horrified silence as the shoemaker, tears streaming down his face, took his crafting knife to the leather. The sound of cutting echoed through the room as he made slow, careful slices into the material he'd spent weeks perfecting. Then came the most unsettling noise, the sound of chewing. It was the forced, rhythmic crunch of a man consuming his own livelihood, while a 17-year-old prince looked on with satisfaction. But this was just the beginning of the horror. It wasn't a one-time event. It was part of a disturbing pattern. The stories coming from the palace kitchens were enough to make even battle-hardened soldiers pale. Carlos had developed a disturbing interest in watching animals die. It wasn't about hunting, which could be seen as noble, nor was it about butchering, which was a necessary task. He craved the experience of witnessing suffering. He would have live rabbits brought to his chambers and then roast them alive over his fireplace, carefully timing how long their screams would last. The servants responsible for cleaning his rooms would often discover the charred remnants arranged in meticulous patterns, resembling some twisted form of art. One young page foolishly laughed at the prince's limp, and Carlos caught it. He was always aware of the ridicule, whether it was real or just in his head. That night, the boy awoke to find the prince looming over him with a glowing poker from the fireplace, casting an orange light in the dark. The only thing that saved him was Carlos's own deformed body letting him down. He swung the poker, but lost his footing, allowing the page to escape, screaming into the hallway. The violence was increasingly difficult to control. During a meeting with Portuguese officials, Carlos abruptly seized a knife from the dinner table and pressed it against an ambassador's throat, demanding that he acknowledge Portugal's inferiority to Spain. The man's careful diplomatic training fell apart as he felt the blade press against his skin and noticed the wild excitement in the prince's eyes. King Philip had to step in personally, calmly persuading his son to lower the weapon as one might do with a rabid dog. However, what frightened the court the most wasn't the violence itself, it was the intelligence behind it. Carlos wasn't just acting out of madness, he was calculating in his cruelty. He knew exactly who he could torment without facing any consequences. He targeted servants, craftsmen, and anyone lacking the political power to fight back. When high-ranking nobles were around, he could easily play the role of a troubled but manageable prince. As soon as they walked out, the pretense fell away. The court doctors began to share their theories. They suggested that the prince's unstable humors led to his excessive aggression. His misshapen skull put pressure on his brain, resulting in uncontrollable urges. Yet, in private, even they questioned whether something darker might be influencing him. Was his madness a direct result of his physical issues, or was it something deeper, an inherent wickedness that would have thrived even in a healthy body? His father, Philip, tried every possible solution. He brought in priests to pray for Carlos. The greatest minds in Europe were consulted for their opinions. Complex routines were set up to help manage the prince's worst behaviors, but nothing seemed to help. In fact, those attempts at control only seemed to inspire him to be more inventive in his cruelty. The servants came up with a detailed warning system to cope with the situation. As Carlos's footsteps echoed down the hallways, that unmistakable lurching gait spread quickly throughout the palace. Chambermaids would drop what they were doing, kitchen boys would sneak into the pantries, and even the guards would suddenly find something urgent to attend to elsewhere. The heir to the throne had turned into a monster that everyone tried to avoid. A prince with such volatility posed a danger, yet he could still be controlled and restrained. That was the case until his father dealt him a psychological blow so personal and humiliating that it set Carlos's anger ablaze. Every man in the Spanish court admired the new queen, Elizabeth of Valois. But Prince Carlos looked at her with something entirely different, the seething resentment of a man mourning what had been taken from him. The betrayal was a brilliant example of political strategy. Elizabeth had initially been promised to Carlos as part of a peace agreement between Spain and France. For months, the young prince had studied her portrait, memorizing every detail of the stunning French princess who was meant to be his wife. For the first time in his troubled life, he had been offered something pure, something that would belong to him alone. However, Philip had other ideas. Recently widowed, the king decided that Spain needed a queen more urgently than it needed a future princess. In a shocking turn of events that stunned the courts across Europe, Philip married Elizabeth himself. The father took away what had been promised to the son, executing the move with the cold precision of a chess master capturing a queen. The day of the wedding was a painful experience, elevated to an art form. Carlos had no choice but to attend, standing there in his specially made outfit that concealed his deformities, and watching his father marry the woman he had been promised. Elizabeth was radiant, youthful, and graceful, everything Carlos could never hope to be. When she recited her vows to Philip, Carlos perceived them as nothing less than a theft. Every word she directed at his father felt like it was really meant for him. And here's the harsh truth. Elizabeth was kind to him. She treated Carlos with real warmth, maybe out of pity, or possibly out of guilt. She affectionately called him her dear cousin and made sure to include him in court events. Yet, her kindness felt like salt on an open wound. Each smile she offered him served as a painful reminder of what he had lost. Every moment of tenderness underscored what he would never possess. The court witnessed this psychological torment unfold every single day. During state dinners, Carlos was seated at the high table, having to watch as his father and Elizabeth shared moments together. He saw how Philip's hand rested possessively on hers and listened to their quiet conversations in French, a language Carlos struggled with because of his speech difficulties. The glances they exchanged hinted at a shared intimacy, a connection that should have belonged to him. Carlos's fixation deepened like a relentless shadow. He positioned himself where he could observe Elizabeth's everyday life. As she strolled through the gardens, he trailed her from a distance, his uneven stride making it impossible to be discreet. The sound of his foot dragging on the gravel turned into a running joke among the courtiers. Everyone knew when the prince was lurking around the queen. He started leaving her gifts that were anything but ordinary, strange and unsettling tokens like dead birds arranged in odd patterns outside her door, and locks of his own hair intricately braided. In one particularly disturbing instance, he left a portrait of her that he had painstakingly marred, scratching out his father's image wherever it appeared and crudely replacing it with his own. Elizabeth managed to handle the situation with remarkable poise. She never voiced her complaints in public and didn't give Carlos the reaction he was hoping for. However, her ladies-in-waiting noted that she had begun to lock her chambers at night and would glance over her shoulder when she walked alone. The once confident French princess now moved through the palace as if she were the hunted. The situation escalated at a court mask ball. Fueled by wine and the anonymity of his disguise, Carlos approached Elizabeth while she was dancing. As the court musicians played, he whispered something in her ear that drained the color from her face. She quickly excused herself, while Philip watched his son with a chilling expression. No one knows for sure what Carlos said that night, but from that point on, Elizabeth was never left alone with him again. Guards were discreetly placed whenever the prince had a chance to run into the queen. Their interactions were restricted to public events, where dozens of people could watch every word and movement. Carlos's humiliation morphed into something more sinister than mere resentment. He started telling anyone who would listen that his father had robbed him of his life, his future, and his very purpose. His rants became more intense and specific, filled with talk of revenge, justice, and reclaiming what he believed was rightfully his. His mind, already a powder keg of resentment and paranoia, was now ready to explode. It would only take a minor trigger to set it off, and that came in the form of a simple staircase. In 1562, Don Carlos chased after a servant girl down a stone staircase, but he never managed to catch her. Instead, his frail body let him down, and he fell. The girl's only offense was that she had seen him without his specially made shoes, exposing his deformed foot in all its raw ugliness. Her startled gasp had ignited his fury. She ran down the narrow service stairs while Carlos stumbled after her, his uneven gait turning his murderous intent into a dangerous awkwardness. His stronger leg tried to compensate for the weaker one, and his misshapen skull threw off his balance. Witnesses claimed he seemed to hang in the air for a moment, arms flailing wildly before gravity took hold. The sound of his head hitting the stone echoed through the palace, like a bell signaling doom. Then there was silence. For 3 days, Carlos lay unconscious with a fractured skull. The already misshapen bone was now cracked like an eggshell, and fluid leaked from his ears. His breathing was labored and sounded like death was closing in. Philip called upon every physician in Spain, offering huge sums of money to anyone who could save his heir. The doctors tried everything that their medieval knowledge could come up with. They bled him until the sheets were drenched in crimson, applied mixtures of ground beetles and mercury, and prayed over him in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. But nothing seemed to work. The prince's fever rose until his skin felt like parchment ready to catch fire. Then came Dr. Pinter had a radical solution. Trepanning. They would drill a hole in the skull to release the evil humors trapped inside. It was a procedure that often resulted in death rather than healing, but Carlos was already dying. In his desperation, Philip agreed to it. The surgery was scheduled for midnight, as the physicians believed the moon's position would aid in recovery. They cleared Carlos's room of everyone except for the medical team and 2 strong men to hold the prince still if he woke up during the operation. The sound of the drill piercing the bone echoed through the palace walls. Later, servants claimed they could still hear it in their nightmares for years to come. The grinding, scraping invasion of the skull. Here's the truly terrifying part. Carlos did wake up. In the middle of the procedure, his eyes flew open. The doctors later noted that he didn't scream. He just looked up at the ceiling, fully aware as they drilled into his skull, his lips moving as if he were praying or cursing. The strong staff had to hold his arms down while his body thrashed, struggling against the restraints as the surgeon continued with his grim task. When the skull finally cracked, there was an audible release of pressure, a wet, sucking sound as trapped blood and fluid rushed out. The surgeon placed a silver tube in the opening to keep it clear so the poison could drain. For 2 weeks, Carlos lay there with a hole in his head, shifting between awareness and delirium. In his feverish dreams, he rambled about Elizabeth, about his father, and about conspiracies that may have been real or just imagined. He talked to people who weren't there, and even had conversations with his deceased mother in Portuguese, a language he had never learned. The doctors took notes, trying to distinguish between fever-induced ramblings and genuine confessions. Then, surprisingly, the fever subsided. Carlos's eyes became clear. He recognized people, spoke clearly, and even managed to eat solid food. The court celebrated, relieved that the crisis had been averted. It seemed like God had shown mercy to the Spanish throne. However, something essential had shifted. The Carlos who emerged from that experience was not the same as the one who had fallen ill. The physical trauma had altered something in his already fragile mind. Where there had once been a mix of cruelty and cunning, now there was only unrestrained, chaotic madness. He became increasingly convinced that everyone around him was conspiring against him. To protect himself, he would test his food for poison by having his servants taste everything before him. He even started sleeping with weapons hidden under his pillow. Additionally, he kept a list of people he considered enemies, along with detailed plans for how he would punish them once he claimed the throne. Most unsettling of all, he began to speak about his father, not with the same bitterness he had felt toward Elizabeth, but with a chilling, calculated demeanor. He would pose hypothetical questions to foreign ambassadors, asking what might happen if a prince needed to remove an unfit king. He inquired about how other countries had dealt with succession when a monarch had seemingly lost God's favor. The person emerging from that sickbed was no longer just a cruel boy or a rejected lover. It was a paranoid, frenzied individual who was now openly discussing the idea of killing his own father, and King Philip was paying attention. He sat in his large, dimly lit study, holding a letter in his hand. This letter was a report from a spy, confirming his worst fear. His son, the heir to the throne, was planning to commit treason. The letter described Carlos's recent meeting with Don Juan of Austria, Philip's half-brother. The prince had suggested escaping to the Netherlands, where Spanish authority was already facing challenges from a rebellion. He intended to position himself as an alternative to his father, a liberator who would offer the freedoms that Philip had denied. The enemies of the Spanish Empire would gather around him, leading to civil war. Philip set the letter down, his hands barely shaking. The walls were adorned with maps showcasing the vast territories of his empire, which stretched from the Americas all the way to the Philippines, all unified under the strong will of the Spanish crown. One reckless prince had the power to destroy it all. Yet this situation went beyond just the empire. It involved a father's love clashing with a king's responsibilities. Philip had exhausted every option to help Carlos. He had forgiven the outbursts, ignored the threats, and rationalized each incident as a result of illness rather than malice. Even now, a part of him wished he could burn the letter and act as if he had never seen it. The king requested more reports, which painted an increasingly troubling picture. Carlos had been stockpiling weapons in his quarters. He attempted to bribe the guards for details about the palace's security. Most troubling of all, he had sent encrypted letters to known adversaries of Spain, gauging their readiness to support a coup. What made Philip's decision particularly tormenting was his understanding of his son's fury. He realized he had let Carlos down as a father. The boy's physical deformities, his madness, and even his cruelty all resulted from decisions made by Philip's ancestors, a lineage that Philip had perpetuated. Every distorted bone in Carlos's body served as a testament to Habsburg pride. Philip began his countermeasures with a heart-wrenching delicacy. He assigned loyal men as new servants to Carlos, who reported back every word. He discreetly had the prince's weapons taken away during cleaning, hoping Carlos wouldn't notice. He even made one last attempt to connect with his son, inviting him for long walks where he spoke about legacy, duty, and the burdens of wearing a crown. Carlos became increasingly paranoid. He started accusing his father of poisoning him, stealing his rightful inheritance, and being a tyrant who had lost the blessing of heaven. One evening during dinner, he stood up and announced to the entire court that Philip was unfit to rule. He insisted that Spain needed fresh leadership, not an old man clinging to power out of fear. The silence that followed was overwhelming. Given the tense international situation, there was no time to waste. Philip's spies had reported that foreign courts were observing and waiting for the right moment. If Carlos decided to escape Spain and presented himself as a wronged prince seeking justice, he would likely gain support. The French would back him against Spain, and the Protestants in the Netherlands would rally around him. The delicate balance of peace in Europe was on the brink of collapse. Philip started sending out letters, dozens of them, to every significant court in Europe. These weren't commands or threats. Instead, they were carefully crafted explanations. He described Carlos's illness in vague but alarming terms, talking about the heavy burden of a father and the terrible responsibilities of a king. He was laying the groundwork, making sure that when he took action, the world would comprehend his intentions. The breaking point came in January 1568, when Carlos gathered his most trusted servants and shared his plan to flee within days. His escape route included going to Italy first, followed by a journey to the Netherlands. He had been promised safe passage and support. In his delusion, he genuinely believed he could return leading an army and reclaim what was rightfully his. One of those trusted servants was a spy for Philip. Within hours, the king learned everything he needed to know. That night, Philip made a decision. He summoned his armor, not for a ceremonial occasion, but for actual battle gear. His advisors were confused, since there was no enemy at the gates and no uprising to quell. However, Philip understood the situation better. The threat was internal. It was his own blood, his own failure, his son. As he secured each piece of armor, Philip underwent a transformation. With every buckle he fastened, the father he once was faded away. What remained was the King of Spain, the defender of the faith, and the guardian of an empire that must not succumb to chaos. The decision was clear. Duty took precedence over family, the kingdom over his son. On the night of January 18, 1568, King Philip II called for his armor, not to ride into battle, but to walk silently down the palace hallway and confront his own child. A doctor leaned in close to the prison door and heard the prince mumbling to himself. He said, "I'm rotting away, and they're just letting me do it." 6 months had gone by since his arrest. Carlos had been moved to a tower room, which was technically comfortable and furnished like a prince's quarters. But it was still a prison. The windows had bars, and the door was locked from the outside. Slowly but surely, the heir to the Spanish throne was deteriorating, even while still alive. His physical decline was alarming. Without any exercise, Carlos's already frail body started to waste away. His shorter leg, no longer having to support weight, shrank even more. Bed sores developed where his twisted spine pressed against the mattress. But the most heartbreaking decline was in his mind. The isolation was fueling his paranoia, making him question what was real. He would have conversations with unseen guests. Servants bringing him meals said he would set the table for people who weren't actually there. His deceased mother, past Spanish kings, and even various versions of himself. He would shout at these apparitions, beg them for answers, and hold entire council meetings with no one in the room. The odor became overwhelming. Carlos refused to take a bath, convinced that the water was tainted. His chamber pot went unemptied for days because he thought the servants were stealing his waste for dark rituals. Sores on his scalp, possibly from an old head injury or just from neglect, constantly oozed. The smell of decay would greet any visitor long before they arrived. But here's the truly horrifying part. Philip was aware. The king got daily updates on his son's condition. He read about the festering wounds, the wild conversations with imaginary beings, and the slow decline of a prince into something almost unrecognizable. Yet, he did nothing. No doctors were sent. No treatments were approved. Carlos was left to decay just as he had said. The prince's moments of clarity might have been even more painful than his madness. He would suddenly understand his situation, grasping what was happening to him. In those instances, he would write desperate letters to his father, switching between pleading for forgiveness and making threats. Philip saved each letter, but never replied. The silence felt more brutal than any form of torture. By July, Carlos could hardly walk anymore. His muscles had deteriorated significantly, and his skin hung loosely over his deformed bones like poorly fitting fabric. Servants noted that he would drag himself across the floor instead of asking for assistance, leaving bloody trails from the sores on his knees. His pride, even amidst his madness, prevented him from showing any signs of weakness. He became fixated on ice. During the scorching Spanish summer, he insisted on having bucket after bucket of ice water. He would drink large amounts and then pour the rest over his feverish head. The physicians, who were banned from treating him, speculated that he was attempting to cool the fire in his mind, to freeze out the madness enveloping him. On July 24, 1568, a servant discovered him unconscious in a pool of ice water. His lips had turned blue, and his breathing was barely detectable. They carried him back to his bed. He had become so light by that point that one man could lift him with ease. For hours, he hovered between life and death, mumbling in languages he had never known and calling for people who had long since passed away. With remarkable clarity, he opened his eyes and uttered his final coherent words. "Tell my father I forgive him." It's impossible to determine if this was true forgiveness or the cruelest form of revenge, leaving Philip to grapple with that mercy. Hours later, Don Carlos of Spain passed away at the age of 23. The official reason listed was natural illness, with no mention of his imprisonment or the months of deterioration. It was simply stated that the prince had become ill and died, as sometimes occurred. The intricate deception started before his body had even cooled. Within hours of his passing, servants arrived with very specific instructions. Every portrait of Carlos was taken down from the palace walls. His belongings were collected and burned. Any letters that mentioned him were gathered and destroyed. The scribes worked late into the night, diligently editing court records to reduce his presence. The heir to the Spanish throne was being erased from history while his body was still warm. His physical condition was deteriorating. His mind had vanished, and his father chose to ignore it all. Carlos was nearing death, yet that wouldn't be his final humiliation. The crown's last act of violence against him would be one of complete silence. Let's return to that cold January night. Now, you can feel the significance of every footstep and every breath in that room. When Philip stood in the doorway clad in armor, he wasn't merely arresting a rebellious son. He was bringing to an end a tragedy that had been marked by blood and pain from the very start. The arrest was quick and precise. Carlos didn't put up a fight. Maybe he couldn't. Perhaps he understood how pointless it was. As the guards tied his hands, he took one last look at his father. Some witnesses said he smiled, while others claimed he cried. The truth was lost with him in that tower room 6 months later. But the real brutality unfolded after his death. Philip's scribes operated with the precision of an inquisition, though their focus wasn't on heresy. Instead, they aimed to erase memory itself. Within weeks, it was as if Don Carlos had never lived at all. Ambassadors who asked about the prince were met with blank stares. Court records jumped from 1544 to 1569, as if those years of his life were simply a void. The funeral was a display of subtlety. There was no grand ceremony and no public viewing. Carlos was laid to rest swiftly and quietly, with only the bare minimum of rituals expected for a prince. His tomb had no inscription except for his name and dates. Even in death, he received just enough recognition to prevent scandal, but not enough to leave a lasting memory. Philip commanded that all documents related to Carlos be burned. Portraits weren't just taken down, they were destroyed entirely, with the canvases cut up and used for firewood. Servants who had served the prince were moved to far-off positions or given pensions, with strict instructions never to mention their time with him. The room where he passed away was locked up and left to collect dust. The official accounts from Philip's time completely overlook Carlos, or just mention him briefly as a frail prince who died young. There's no reference to his arrest, his imprisonment, or the dreadful decline he suffered. There's certainly no recognition of how a father contributed to his son's downfall. Philip had orchestrated the perfect murder, not of a person, but of a narrative. However, you can't truly erase a story. 2 centuries later, the forgotten prince started to emerge again, not in the carefully curated Spanish histories, but in the works of Spain's rivals. Friedrich Schiller, the German playwright, came across pieces of Carlos's story and recognized not a mad prince, but a tragic hero oppressed by tyranny. His play Don Carlos reimagines the twisted and cruel prince as a symbol of youthful idealism, ultimately crushed by the oppressive era in which he lived. Giuseppe Verdi took Schiller's story and brought it to life through music. In Verdi's opera, Carlos emerges as a tragic lover, noble yet doomed. The monster who once forced shoemakers to eat leather, who roasted rabbits alive, and who plotted against his own father. All of that faded away. Instead, we see a romantic martyr, a victim of political necessity and harsh fate. The irony is striking. Philip won every battle. He maintained his empire, controlled the narrative, and erased his shameful son from history. Yet, in doing so, he created a void that artists filled with their own interpretations. The true Carlos, both physically and mentally twisted, has been left behind. The fictional Carlos, who is both beautiful and tragic, has achieved immortality. Even today, in opera houses around the globe, audiences are moved to tears as tenor voices resonate through Verdi's arias. They grieve for a prince who never truly lived, while the real Don Carlos, the child king consumed by his own tainted blood, is entirely overlooked. King Philip triumphed in his quest for the throne, silencing his son and erasing his legacy. Yet, despite this, the tale of Don Carlos, the child king eaten from within, continues to endure. It is a story that remains relevant even now,